yn fawr iawn. Yn gyntaf, rydw I jyst eisiau dweud diolch yn fawr iawn o'r galon I angharad Sarah Ellen Roberts am fy wahodd I siarad heddiw. Yn union fel Gerald bore yma, rydw innau hefyd yn teimlo ychydig o imposter syndrome. Blynyddoedd yn ôl, mewn bywyd arall, astudiais I yn adran y Gymraeg yn Aberystwyth gyda Patrick Sims-Williams, Ian Hughes, Simon Rodway. Yn ddiweddarach, ar ôl gorffen PhD mewn astudiaethau canoloesol yn yr Unol Daleithiau gyda thraethawd ymchwil am gyfraith canoloesol yn Ne Ffrainc, clywais I unwaith eto llef erchwys arall yn gyrru y genc cyntaf. A gyda chefnogaeth garedig Sarah Ellen Roberts, rydw I wedi cychwyn ar hynt newydd. Hefyd, rydw I eisiau dweud sori am fy Nghymraeg. Byddaf i'n siarad heddiw yn Saesneg ac yn ateb cwestiynau yn Saesneg. Ond gobeithio yn wir, byddaf i'n gallu siarad yn y Gymraeg i'r grŵp hwn yn y dyfodol. Okay. Scholars of medieval Welsh law have long remarked on the puzzling reference in the Begwred grouping of manuscripts to canonwyr, canonists or maybe canons, more on that later, as the final authority in those judicial appeals under native law which involve inconsistencies between law book texts. These appeals, as apparently contradictory as they are, raise significant questions about the nature of legal learning, both secular and ecclesiastical, in medieval Wales. What knowledge or training did canonists, or canons, possess, which made them ideal, or even, frankly, capable, to carry out such determination? Hugh Price has argued that the Latin Welsh law texts, a version of which the core Begwred text is almost certainly a translation, betray, quote, specifically ecclesiastical preoccupations and interests, unquote, and therefore were likely compiled or at least modified by a monastic or ecclesiastically trained scribe. In order to take some first steps towards explaining this phenomenon, it's necessary first to discuss Welsh legal appeals more generally and the specific problems that they raise, then discuss them in the context of both broader development of medieval Welsh law and broader European intellectual society. In doing so, I'll argue that the texts intentionally evoke not answers to be found in the Concordia Discordiantorum Canonum per se, but the scholastic methodology of reconciling different textual authorities in general, and in so doing, make an implicit as well as explicit argument for the primacy of written law. The study of medieval Welsh law has long been vexed by the paucity of concrete evidence for legal practice, especially when compared to its neighbor on the other side of Offa's Dyke. The few examples we do have, such as those which have been discussed elsewhere at length by, among others, Sarah Ellen Roberts and Hugh Price, give us relatively little context within which to frame the detailed but sometimes dubious procedures outlined in the law books themselves. In other words, to paraphrase Professor Roberts, we see little of the, quote, law in action, unquote, even while we have plenty of, quote, law in theory. The inevitable result is that our views of the practical utility of medieval Welsh law have varied widely, spanning a wide spectrum of interpretations from T.P. Ellis's exhaustive but naive attempts to reconcile the disparate legal textual traditions into a single authoritative code, to, on the other hand, much more recently, Robin Chapman Stacey's contention that medieval Welsh law can and should also be read as a form of literature, or at least is deeply influenced by the tropes, forms, and expectations of literary texts. Indeed, the lesson of recent scholarship has been that we must resist the impulse to categorically label medieval law as entirely practical or entirely fictional. In Welsh law, for instance, tractates which are clearly extremely practical in form, such as the Cynghawsedd and the Damwainia, clearly intended as a reference for student or practicing lawyers, coexist with the laws of court, and other tractates whose provisions, as Professor Stacey so eloquently and humorously demonstrated, were outdated, or even imaginary. Just as often, however, we're confronted with material whose practicality is harder to judge, since the text is unclear about how exactly it is to be implemented, and few, if any, external sources exist to contextualize it. Perhaps the clearest, and in my opinion, the most frustrating example of this kind of material is that concerned with the appeal of judicial verdicts. Medieval Welsh law lays out a procedure for appeal, which, at least in its most basic form, seems practical enough. And as it seems virtually unthinkable that there should not be some form of appeal, lest the legal system be unable to meet the needs of those who use it. All three redactions of the Welsh laws contain some reference to ymwystlaw, or mutual pledging, whereby a plaintiff or respondent could challenge the judge who had issued a verdict to pledge or gage against the correctness of his judgment. Although, frustratingly, this is often discussed only in passing, we can nevertheless generally reconstruct how it might have worked. Let's start with a version in the Iorwerth redaction, whose origins conventionally are placed in the 13th century courts of Gwynedd and may represent a phase of native legal innovation before the conquest. In the laws of court in the Iorwerth redaction, after a long discussion of the privileges of the court justice, we find the following. If it happens that a person mutually pledge, If it happens that a person mutually pledge with a court justice or another judge, if that person can prove that the judgment is wrong, the judge loses his tongue, or he redeems it from the king for the value set in law. If the judge triumphs, his sarheid is paid to him. And then the text establishes that value, as it always does, right, for sarheid. This seems, at first glance, simple enough. A party to a suit may appeal, and if the judgment is overturned on appeal, the judge must pay the wronged plaintiff or respondent what amounts to a fine, fixed at an arbitrary value. However, pay to the king a fine fixed at an arbitrary value, however evocatively or painfully described. Likewise, if the appeal is denied, the judge must be paid compensation for his damaged reputation. We are likewise told how this is achieved practically. No judge, we are told, ought to accept a pledge after he come for his place of judgment, except by his own will. Since suits of land seem to have been, unsurprisingly, one of the most common forms of lawsuit, and these were traditionally heard on the disputed piece of land in question, the general impression is that this was meant to give certainty and resolution to all of the parties involved, including the judge. And I will note, of course, that it also echoes similar procedures in civil law, where an appeal must be made instanter, viva voce, before within 3 days after the judgment. Anyway, since suits of land seem to have been, unsurprisingly, one of the most common forms, furthermore, there exist model plaints, cynghausaeth, which seem to refer to this procedure in action. For example, in the collection of cynghausaeth found in Cotton D2, itself a version of Llyfr Iorwerth, God knows a plaintiff is instructed to say, on account of having been given an incorrect judgment by mistaken law, I pledged myself, with the one who judged it, and it was overturned back to me. And if you doubt that, there are enough who can testify to it. And after that, you trespassed upon me, and today I demand that I be compensated. So far, so good. But how is such an appeal to be decided? A judge, we are told, quote, ought not to accept a wager from a layman unless he promise a better judgment than that which he was given from another judge. As we are told in all three redactions that the king or lord or the court justice or some other appointed judge will hear the case and select the better judgment, we could claim that we now have a fairly reasonable working knowledge of appeal procedure in medieval Welsh law, particularly as pertains to 13th century Gwynedd. Of course, it's not nearly that simple, and here is where the procedure begins to depart from any easy presumption of practicality. In any legal proceeding, how do we decide what constitutes a, quote, better judgment, unquote, or for that matter, a, quote, good judgment, unquote, or a bad judgment? In any number of recent high-profile cases litigated and relitigated and relitigated and relitigated in popular media, much ink, virtual or otherwise, has been spilled in pursuit of labeling a particular judgment good or bad. it seems obvious to say a judgment is good when it is fair. But this is simply renaming the problem instead of solving it, right? What is fair? And since rare indeed is the case where both plaintiff and respondent believe that a decision is fair, to paraphrase Daniel Lord Smale, justice to a medieval litigant generally means a fair chance of winning one's claim or counterclaim outright. Furthermore, the attempts by the Lawbook redactions to explain how this is to work further muddle the picture. Among the legal material appended to Pennyarth Manuscript 259b, that's Llysgriuennedic Pumfred, of course, Siglum Z, is a lengthy instruction to an appellant seeking to substantiate his appeal by the production in court of a justice who knows a better judgment. Pulling him, one must imagine, from his pocket and dusting lint off him, or else launching him as from a Pokeball. No one may pledge himself with a judge except by bringing a judge who might expound a judgment which is better than his. One can hardly imagine the awkwardness which must result from a situation, from such a situation, as the appealed judge and the evidentiary judge stare each other down in court. Given that lawyering and knowledge of the law seems to have run in families, one must wonder how many family reunions were spoilt by sharp words across the suckling pig. What this section and others like it do not resolve is the essential problem at the heart of this procedure. Although it is intuitive that if an appellant against, say, an untried and green justice such as myself were to produce Sarah Ellen Roberts from his pocket, that her determination should outrank mine. It is very difficult, except in the most inexact terms, to quantify what exactly makes her judgments better than mine on their face alone. And this version of the law, at least, does not attempt to do so. Furthermore, the stakes seem to have been higher than simply accepting the overturning of a verdict, or even simply paying the fine that would be owed for a wrongful judgment. A reference in a legal triad to such an appeal claims, if a bad judgment is made by a judge, let him purchase his tongue from the Lord for as much of the price as the price gives me of all the rest of him, and let him never subsequently be a judge, since his judgment is not the legal judgment. This is the price of his tongue, 22 pounds. The sentiment is repeated elsewhere in slightly different terms, but the gist is broadly the same. If a judge should have a sentence overturned, he should not subsequently again be a judge. This is ludicrous. As any practicing lawyer or judge would tell you, sentences are overturned for many reasons, few of which have to do with incompetence. And the stock of available judges would plummet until the entire legal system ceased to function. Either this is simply an elaboration in the line of those discussed by Robin Chapman Stacey, or else such appeals rarely, if ever, succeeded. It seems logical, then, that the more expansive appellate procedure given in the Belguded redaction represents either a development from this strategy or perhaps a parallel development. Thus, from Jesus College Manuscript 57, Siglum J. If it is said by anyone concerning the judge that he judged a wrong verdict upon him, let both of them place their gauges in the hand of the king, and if the judge is overruled, and written law demonstrates that he should be overruled, note the written, we'll come back to that, let him pay the king for his office the worth of his tongue, and henceforth let him never judge. One ought not to trust a judgment, nor to accept it between two pledges concerning a judge, except one which is demonstrated in written law. The emphasis on written law here is significant. The contest between two judgments is here figured not as a disagreement between two people in their respective judgments, but rather between a person and a written text, with the text clearly positioned as the superior authority. This represents not just a convenient system for resolving disputes, but a conceptual shift in which a better judgment can no longer be interpreted to mean, say, the most appropriate for the situation, or the one most similar to previous judgments in similar cases, which are both ideas offered elsewhere in medieval Welsh law, but rather that which is according to a specific written text. This is restated more emphatically later on. And in this way it is adjudicated. First, the king ought in a conciliatory manner to hear in the court the argument of the one who contradicts the judge, and afterwards the answer of the judge in its entirety. Afterwards, the one who might speak against the judge ought to show from a book of law a more appropriate judgment than the one which the judge displays, if sufficient, and thus he defeats the judge. If not sufficient, it is the judge who wins, since it is not enough for anyone to hold insufficient the pledge of the judge, if the other cannot, for his part, show a more suitable judgment in written law. The idea that written law should trump the learning and experience of a judge does not merely introduce a new source of judicial authority, it seems to presuppose the existence of an authoritative, even single, set of laws. Now, the idea of a single, ideal, fixed law is supported by extensive references through the Welsh legal system to the supposedly authoritative work of the Legislative Assembly of Hywel Dda, modified though it may have been by other sources of legal and political legitimacy. In that story, as everyone present very well knows, Hywel calls together a number of legal authorities, and their exact makeup varying from version to version, who create the core of medieval Welsh law. Quote, they considered the old laws, and some of them they allowed to continue, and others they amended, and others they completely destroyed, and others they imposed as new creations. Right? Although all three redactions do show relationships to each other, the extent to which this originates in a putative, Cyfraith Hywel, and what form such a text might have taken is still to be determined. Furthermore, and perhaps more importantly for our purposes, such a vision of a textually unitary law is contradicted by the Lawbooks themselves, which display both baffling antiquarianism and sparkling innovation in their heterogeneity. If this procedure has any hope of working in the real world, therefore, it must account for the fact that there will exist multiple versions of even this supposedly ideal law. Fortunately, the previous section continues. If the dispute of the two opposed parties shall be in written law, the verdict shall be referred to the canonwyr, who practice truthfulness. And that which is seen to be nearest to the truth is the most worthy to be sustained according to the law. What the heck does that mean? Likewise, the version given in Latin D, a manuscript very close to that which was likely translated to create the Blaguted redaction, is as follows. If, moreover, there shall be a doubt concerning two contrary things written in law, again, written, note, the responsibility for judgment must be placed upon the canonici. I leave that word untranslated for now. Well versed in truth, which is closer in truth to is in the laws more appropriate to be maintained. The exact interpretation of this passage has been much debated, beginning with the precise translation of canonwyr / canonici. The word itself is a regular close compound. The second element is clearly guir, meaning men, and the first element, canon, taken directly from Latin and thus eventually from Greek. The problem is, however, that whereas in English we call those who study canon law canonists, and those who belong to regular or secular groups of clergy attached to a cathedral canons, no such distinction seems to have been made in Middle Welsh. Thus it is that even authorities disagree. Hugh Price has argued for canons, arguing that to interpret canonwyr as canonists, quote, constitutes interpretation rather than strict translation, unquote. Thus, he envisions an appeal such as that tantalizingly mentioned in a very late and rare example of Cyfraith Hywel in court, in which parties to a land suit in 1510 were ordered to appear, quote, before the canons of the Lord King at Winchester, unquote, although he concedes that it is most unlikely that these canons will have possessed expertise in Welsh law. Instead, he suggests that the Blaguted text's assignment of the reconciliation of textual differences to canons is in accordance with their belief that canons were, quote, well versed in truth, which he ascribes specifically to the fact that they would have been trained in canon law. I respectfully submit that this is arriving at precisely the same destination by another route, a substitute bus service, if you will. In either case, the authority of canons or canonists to hear and decide the appeal rests upon their knowledge of canon law. This would seem to have thrown up yet another obstacle, or perhaps the same obstacle in a new costume. How on earth would a knowledge of canon law help to decide which of the myriad of redactions and versions of the Welsh law books should triumph in, say, a dispute between two neighbors over the precise boundary lines of a parcel of land in the countryside outside Aberystwyth? Although this sort of issue is, of course, also addressed by canon law, surely we cannot assume that canon law was arbitrarily to be used in place of Cyfraith Hywel if and only if two conflicting native law books were found. Although the work of scholars like D.B. Walters and Price himself have clearly shown that the influence of canon law can be seen on various points of Welsh law also deviates significantly from canon law, especially on issues such as marriage, to the extent that it was famously condemned on the eve of the conquest by John Peckham, the Archbishop of Canterbury, as, quote, irrational and immoral, unquote. Perhaps, therefore, it is not canon law itself which is invoked in Blagodet, but rather the means by which textual differences or contradictions in canon law were themselves adjudicated. To understand why this is, we have to think first about the nature of the Blagodet text itself, and then about the models which existed for such an adjudication. Firstly, as Professor Roberts has demonstrated, the Blagodet text, like the Ysgriuennedic text, represents an ongoing process of legal systemization and organization intended to both make the text more useful and relevant in the practice of actual law. It may be this impulse which underlies the decision of a redactor to intentionally omit most of the laws of court from one family of Blagodet manuscripts, save only and tellingly material covering the justice of the court, referring to the rest as, quote, a fruitless expense of vellum and ink, unquote. Simultaneously, this impulse may underpin the insistence on the use of written law, both because it makes the law increasingly accessible to non-trained jurists, something which is explicitly provided for at Blagodet, and because it elevated or authorized Welsh law against the increasingly written legal codes of the rest of Europe. It surely can be no accident that this effort begins in the late 13th and early 14th centuries. This is the age of Beaumanoir and the coutumiers of France, and not long after the time of Bracton. If, has been argued, the laws of court are kept in law books as long as they are because they lend authority to the text and credence to the Hywel Dda story, then we might seek to explain this reference to Canonwyr in the same way. What implicit claims does it make on behalf of the law books that included it? The issue of resolving discrepancies between written sources of canon law, meanwhile, was one which had much occupied the scholars of an earlier age, most famously the legal scholar Gratian, whom Anders Winroth characterizes perfectly alongside Peter Lombard as, quote, the twin pillars on which medieval education and theoretical and practical theology were built. The system of nuanced principles employed by Gratian to reconcile conflicts between his various written sources, building on earlier attempts by scholars like Burchard of Worms and Ivo of Chartres, was so effective that his decretum remained valid law in the Catholic Church until early in the 20th century, influencing virtually every subsequent period of legal development. The mechanics of his method, however, are not immediately applicable to Welsh law. There does not seem to be any equivalent of a comparison between, say, a regional and an ecumenical council, or a council and a papal rescript, or anything of that nature. Once again, perhaps what is being invoked here is not the contents of the text itself. And trust me, I spent a lot of time reading parts of the decretum to try to find any sort of resonance. But the idea of a single authoritative textual tradition, permitting, of course, for local variation, as do the Welsh law texts, sometimes grudgingly. Furthermore, that the work of the canonists, and even Gratian in particular, with the ideas they contained, were known in Wales, has been demonstrated by Hugh Price extensively in his Native Law of the Church in Medieval Wales. As I mentioned earlier, Price has further argued that the redactors of Blagodet display, quote, specifically ecclesiastical preoccupations and interests, unquote, and are thus likely ecclesiastics of some type, which only makes sense given the nature of scribes in the Middle Ages. Yet it's not my intention to suggest that in arguing that a verdict should be weighed by the canonists, it should be decided on principles of canon law, right? What I want to suggest, rather, both in this paper and I hope in a project that will come out of it that the intention is to invoke the idea of an authoritative textual law, which can be arrived at through the careful comparison of textual variants, even though such a text may never have existed. In doing so, the redactors defend the status and authority of Welsh law, implicitly comparing it to the monolithic decretals of Gregory IX, or other ecclesiastical compendia, at a time when social and political realities around them were drastically changing. But doesn't that, you say, leave us back where we started yet again? So at least so far as appeals are concerned? Could canons or canonists really decide textually between two variants of Welsh law using some process akin to Gratian's harmony of discordant law books? Most likely not. If they did decide regularly, as they did in the supposedly in the 1510 case, it's likely that Price is correct in saying they were largely free to do so as they saw fit. Regardless of whether or not this strategy worked in practice, however, just to invoke the specter, if you want, of Gratian and his ilk, continued what seems to have been one of the main projects of the Blagoted redactor, to further underpin, or I should say redactors, to further underpin and emphasize the authority of written text, where extant, over spoken law. The Blagoted redaction does, I feel obliged to point out, usually make sure to say that unwritten law is still admissible in arguments in court. But even the fact that it specifically says that is interesting. We might even go a step further and suggest that, although it may not seem obvious that the reference to, quote, putting it to the canons, unquote, is intended to shore up a section of the procedure or about which the redactor or scribe felt apprehensive, since for us, the effect is to merely supplant one baffling suggestion that two books be squared off against each other, like board game pieces, right, with another, that churchmen potentially possessing zero knowledge of Cyfraith Hywel might be called upon to judge between two law books. But rather that the mere existence of such a procedure gave legitimacy to the idea that written law can and should be privileged in court at all, lest the production of law books produce a stalemate. In order to do so, the text therefore invokes not just the authority of the church per se, but broader legal ideas and trends circulating in medieval Europe. In doing so, we might also suggest it increases the prestige and status of those who owned or wrote the law books. It is surely no coincidence that virtually all surviving law books date from this period, nor that it corresponds with the rise of a class of learned experts, dosbarthwyr, which Professor Roberts has discussed elsewhere. It is still, of course, highly entertaining to imagine lawyers producing law books from under their robes, mostly regardless of their contents, as a sort of Uno reverse in court, only to be double reversed by the judge, and find themselves waiting for a decision by canonists, perhaps all the way in Westminster. Thank you very much.